Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. and our program, Taiwan and China Relations in the Wake of the January 14 presidential election in Taiwan. I'm Heidi Hsu, President of the World Affairs Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and our distinguished panel here this evening. Our speakers are well equipped to address the issues of cross-strait relations between China and Taiwan. Alan Romberg is the director of the East Asia program at the Henry L. Stimson Center and has led a distinguished career in and out of government, including 20 years as a Foreign Service officer, during which time he served as the principal deputy secretary of the policy planning staff at the State Department. Dr. Robert Sutter is a professor of practice of international affairs at the George Washington University, and he also chairs the Atlantic Council's program on China-Taiwan relations. Thomas J. Reckford will moderate the panel. Tom is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the regional director for East Asia at the National Leadership Forum on Global Challenges. He is also vice chairman of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Tom?
Thank you very much, Heidi. I'd just like to add a couple of extra words about my two marvelous colleagues here on the panel. Alan is one of the leading specialists on Taiwan in the country. There's no question about that. He's also the author of a book, Rein In at the Precipice, which is used by all scholars on Taiwan. And Bob, whom I have literally known for 35 years. We've been talking about China-Taiwan issues that long, really. Had a marvelous career at the Congressional Research Service. He did teach at Georgetown before teaching at George Washington University. And the third edition of his book on Chinese foreign relations, power and policy since the Cold War has just been reissued in its third edition. So you should all run out and buy it.
Yes.
I'm going to begin with questions for both of my colleagues on the elections in January in Taiwan. And I want to emphasize that they weren't just presidential elections. They were legislative elections as well. And this was the first time that Taiwan has ever had its legislative elections come at the same time as its presidential elections. So this was a banner year for those who follow politics in Taiwan. My first question for Alan Romberg. President Ma Ying-jeou won re-election against Dr. Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party by a pretty good margin, 52 to 46%. What were the key issues, and why was it a closer contest than the presidential election of 2008?
Thanks very much, Tom. And let me say I appreciate the invitation to be here and to be on the panel with my longtime colleague, Bob Sutter. We've been on a lot of panels together on a lot of different subjects, so I look forward to this evening. Let me start with the last part of your question. Why the big difference? In 2008, it really was, in part, a referendum on the administration of the previous president, Chen Shui-bian. And he had been very badly discredited. The economy was seen as having deteriorated under his aegis, but also there were a lot of corruption scandals and so on. In fact, he's in jail at this point. And it was simply a big turn away from the DPP, which had been his party, which had been seen to be also quite a troublemaker in cross-strait relations and in relations with the United States. And I think people in Taiwan opted for stability, hopefully restoration of the economy, and honesty. And if you go back, in fact, and look at Ma Ying-jeou's inaugural address in 2008, he stresses all of those themes. This election actually turned on, I would say, on also the issue of stability in a way. The campaign was about a lot of different things. The opposition candidate, Tsai Ing-wen, wanted to make it a campaign about social justice and equity and economic equality and a lot of domestic issues. And indeed, she raised a lot of questions which I think Ma is going to have to pay attention to over the next 4 years because they were serious issues. The cross-strait relationship was also a big piece of this. Ma stressing that he had a formula under the so-called 92 consensus, and we can talk about what that was, which provided for the maintenance of Taiwan's functional independence and sovereignty, and yet progress, significant progress in cross-strait relations. Tsai did not come up with a formula which was going to do that. And indeed the U.S., and I assume you may want to get into this at some point, but the U.S. government made known that it was concerned about her lack of ability. Let me say one more thing on this, and that is the 800,000 vote margin was considerably more than most polls suggested it would be. And I think it's not illogical that it was a significant, it was a solid victory. It wasn't a razor thin victory. And again, I think that people in Taiwan didn't really have a reason to change. And so I think what you found was, for the most part, people who had supported the so-called pan-green, the DPP and its allies, did so again, and those who supported the pan-blue, the KMT and its allies, did so, and the result was, in a sense, if you look back on it, pretty predictable.
Good. There was a third-party candidate for the presidency, James Sung, who had broken away from the Kuomintang in the previous election. He was expected to do pretty well, but only ended up with 3% of the vote. What happened to his candidacy?
Well, I have to tell you that friends of mine who are polling experts in Taiwan said he will not get, early on, said he will not get more than 4% of the vote, which is what he polled when he ran for mayor of Taipei. Mm. So what you had was a lot of dissatisfaction with Ma on the part of some people who were more conservative within the Kuomintang, and maybe some people in the DPP also who wanted to skew the polls, who told pollsters they supported James Sung. What also seems to have happened at the very end is that pan-blue supporters, some whom either might have stayed home because they didn't really want to support Ma very much, or might have voted for James Sung, got worried that Tsai Ing-wen actually could win. And so, perversely in a way, they went out in larger numbers than might have been anticipated and voted for Ma. But I don't think the result, the margin may have been somewhat different, but I think that the result was, for the reasons I stated, pretty much one that people should have expected.
Yeah, I was very interested because the polls had showed the presidential election as being pretty close, and then Ma pulled away. Bob, I'd like to ask you about the 92 consensus, because everybody talked about it in the Taiwan elections, but one had the feeling that a lot of people who talked about it didn't understand what it really was all about.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I think a lot of people don't understand what it's really all about. It basically is an understanding between the Taiwan administration and the Chinese administration on that allows them to finesse the issue of one China. This issue of one China is a real dividing issue between Taiwan and China. Taiwan doesn't want to be seen as part of one China, with Beijing being the leader of China. So this is something they have to finesse in some way. Well, the Ma Ying-jeou administration has been able to finesse this issue using the 92 consensus, an understanding that the two sides have that where they don't challenge one another's sovereignty in a direct way, and they're able to move forward. And Beijing sees it as satisfactory enough of an understanding on one China that allows them to make agreements with Taiwan that they otherwise wouldn't make. The issue in the campaign came when Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party won't accept the 92 consensus. And so what she was doing by not accepting this was making it uncertain how indeed she would have a relationship with China. And if she were elected, China might have reacted quite differently than we have seen in recent years. And progress in cross-strait relations probably would have come to slowed down, if not come to a halt, and there'd be a lot of uncertainty. And I think most people that look at this issue in the United States and, of course, in China, and I think in the voters in Taiwan, they don't want that uncertainty. I think this is, and the reason, the points that Alan made and you've been making, Tom, are very much to the point in underlying this issue. But I would just add something. Because I'm a big believer in recent history and the context of this election and the improvement in cross-strait relations is an extremely disruptive period, beginning in the 1995, going on to the end of the Chen Shui-bian administration, where you had repeated crises in the Taiwan Straits, you had confrontational politics in Taiwan. And much of this, Ma Ying-jeou has succeeded in ending that and in moving Taiwan and China forward in their relationship and in a way that, from the U.S. government point of view, smooths out the situation, avoids major crises. And so they don't want to go back on that. So when Tsai Ing-wen was challenging this 1992 consensus, saying that she wouldn't abide by it, this was a cause of great concern in China. If she were elected, it would have been a big issue. And one of the reasons that the U.S. government seemed to be less than supportive of Tsai Ing-wen as she was campaigning was because of this issue, that the uncertainty that would come from not supporting the 1992 consensus, which allows the one China issue to be dealt with in an effective way between the two sides and allows the two sides to move forward in their relationship.
Tom, can I add something to this?
Sure.
I totally agree with this. The essence of the 1992 consensus is acceptance of one China. The two sides have different interpretations of what that means, but it's an acceptance of one China. Tsai Ing-wen, based perhaps, I think, also on her own belief, but certainly on her party's belief, could not accept the existence of one China that included both the mainland and Taiwan. And maybe more than Bob does, I'm quite convinced that, in fact, Beijing would have cut off the talks that have been going on that led to the 16 agreements that have been reached, and in a number of other ways, in essence, imposed a penalty on Taiwan for putting in office somebody who would not accept a version of one China. At one point, they seemed more flexible about whether it would be the 92 consensus or something that would be the functional equivalent. But as the election came towards the end, they toughened up again. And as Bob's saying, the focus was on the 92 consensus. And Tsai Ing-wen was in no position to accept that. She tried to put forward what she called a Taiwan consensus, which meant we'll all think about what we really want and we'll come together. And then once we've got a domestic consensus, then we can approach the mainland. There's a lot of logic to that. It just doesn't happen to work when you're trying to have a relationship with the other side that doesn't accept your position.
Right. Well, you both talked about uncertainty, but isn't there a lot of hypocrisy in the 92 consensus? After all, they're really agreeing to different things. The concept of one China means something totally different in Taiwan than it is in China. Isn't this uncertainty?
Yes, yes. We're dealing with a very fragile sort of understanding here. This is, and that's why it's so the voters in Taiwan seem to think it's much better to have the current administration and their approach continuing rather than take a chance on the situation if someone else were elected, because it is delicate. It's a very delicate understanding.
I would call it constructive ambiguity. No, I really would.
You can see the State Department speaking here. Well, let's move on to the legislative elections, because I don't want them to be ignored in this process. The Kuomintang, the party of President Ma, won 64 seats this time around versus 81 4 years ago. And the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, went up to 40 from 27. Who benefited from having the legislative and presidential elections on the same day? Alan?
Well, I think initially there was a thought that the KMT would benefit, that there would be coattails and so on and so forth. I think that at the end of the day, no party particularly gained from it. I think, again, there's one of the points I mentioned earlier but didn't stress, a fair amount of dissatisfaction with the Ma administration's handling of the economy, a lot of which wasn't, frankly, their fault, but some of which was. They were overwhelmed by the international financial and economic crisis and came back very strongly with, close to 11% growth last year.
Yeah.
So there was dissatisfaction over that. There was dissatisfaction over, as I said, social and economic equity issues. The DPP was better organized, had shed a lot of the bad images that Bob talked about coming from the Chen Shui-bian era. And I think it was a pretty natural result of this. Now, the KMT got more bang for the buck, if you will. They got 45% of the vote, but 64 seats. The DPP got 35% of the vote, but only 40 seats. The fact is, in the legislature, there is a procedure under which these numbers may not matter all that much. They each have representation on a committee which decides how legislation is going to be handled. And so the issue is going to be whether the DPP decides to be cooperative and the KMT decides to work with them, or whether they're each going to try to show up the other party. One hopes for the former, but one needs to watch.
Well, if I remember correctly from the days when Chen Shui-bian was president, the KMT wasn't helpful to him in the legislative yuan. So, you know, in a way, you couldn't blame the DPP for getting a little revenge.
But the DPP is sort of at a crossroads now. They have to decide what they're going to do, because Tsai is no longer the leader of the DPP. They have to select a new leader. This is a defeat for the DPP. They didn't do as well as they might have done. And some predictions were that they would get 45 seats, and they got 40. And so, so they have to decide which direction they're going to go. Are they going to be obstructionists, as you implied, Tom, as the KMT was obstructionist when Chen Shui-bian was president? And that could happen. But I think it's more commentary seems to focus on the DPP moving to the center in some way, continuing to move in the center. Tsai Ing-wen moved the party to the center more than Chen Shui-bian was, and this presumably has more appeal for younger voters, and so they would try to move in that direction, which would have some appeal for younger voters. Keep in mind that the so-called the DPP is known as the Green Party, and so you have this green image that we use for the DPP. So the dark greens, the really radical DPP people, are all my age, you see, and so they're really lots of old people doing this sort of thing, and so the radicals in the DPP are really old, and so if they were going to be obstructionists, the radicals would sort of like that, you see, and block issues and so forth. But if they're going to move to the center, they're going to have to move away from this radical base and have a broader base, a broader appeal. The elections results showed the DPP is back to where they usually are, and if they're going to be a contender, they're going to have to do something that gets them over the usual, which is a minority position. And so that's, so obstructionism may not be the way to do that.
Okay. What about the divisions within the country? You get a sense that the KMT does very well in the northern part of Taiwan, and the DPP does very well in the south, and it's the northern part that has gained the most from globalization, from the special economic ties with China.
I think the globalization is affecting all of Taiwan, and so these attitudes and the relationship with China, China of course is working hard to appeal to southern Taiwan through agricultural policies that import policies that benefit companies and producers in southern Taiwan. So I think that globalization has this cross-island effect, but you still do have this residual southern Taiwan being more green and northern Taiwan being more KMT. Taiwan's been living with that for a long time. I don't think it's really had a destabilizing effect. I mean, the issue in the years ago, this issue was an issue of mainlanders versus Taiwanese. This is with the mainlanders, the people that came with Chiang Kai-shek and their descendants were heavily based in northern Taiwan, and the Taiwanese who had been really oppressed by the KMT Chiang Kai-shek government were in the south, and those memories made for this division. Well, those memories are fading, and younger people don't care as much about those things. So I think this is something that's naturally going to change over time with the change in generations.
Bob, you mentioned that there'd been a lot of progress on economic issues between Taiwan and China, and of course now you can fly directly between Taiwan and China. In the old days, you couldn't do that. If a Taiwanese businessman wanted to go to China, he had to go through Hong Kong or some other Singapore, some other place. What more can be done on the economic level, and perhaps more important, is there anything that can be done on the political and security level?
On the economic side, they have this de facto free trade agreement that they've signed, the so-called ECFA. And this agreement has been signed, but it has to be implemented. And this involves a whole series of meetings, and they have to figure out various stages that they're going to go through in implementing this agreement. And so this will keep them busy, I think, for a number for a year or two or even more. And therefore, the economic issues can remain front and center, and you can have progress in economic issues and exchange of people, students, this type of thing can occupy your attention and show progress for some time. The political side is probably not going to be a lot of progress there. President Ma talked briefly during the campaign about having a peace agreement with China, and that seemed to be something he backed away from pretty quickly. And so I think to move forward for political improvement is going to be more difficult and more sensitive. Remember that the people in Taiwan remain anxious about their position vis-a-vis China. They worry about their sovereignty, they worry about their future, and they don't want it to be mortgaged in some way by the leaders of Taiwan. So I think they're going to be resistant to some degree in this regard, and I don't think President Ma is going to move forward on this side. Some say that maybe China will press for political progress. They won't be satisfied with these understandings on economics and social issues. But I also think that over the next year or two, the Chinese administration has a whole host of issues they have to deal with at a time of major leadership transition. So the assessments of many observers, and I agree with them, is that the administration of China is going to be preoccupied. And so if the Taiwan situation is more or less moving in the right direction, they don't have much of an incentive to really make an issue out of this, of the lack of political progress with Taiwan, at least in the short term, because that's risky. and it could risk backlash in Taiwan, which would really jeopardize the long-term approach that they have toward Taiwan.
And of course, China is going to have its own elections, I guess, later this year. Probably not as competitive as the elections we've had in Taiwan.
Rumor has it it's not as competitive, yes.
Alan, is there any hope for military confidence building measures? And is there, I mean, China has some 1,500 missiles pointed at Taiwan. This is not exactly endearing. Is there a chance that China could be persuaded to point some of these missiles somewhere else?
The answer is I don't know about the last question. I think that there is good reason for Beijing to think about it. Because let's start with the proposition that they worry over the long term that Taiwan independence advocates will be able to push their agenda. And they insist on maintaining a deterrent, an effective deterrent, including a military deterrent against that, okay? And I think, you know, they have an argument to make, in the sense that I think people in Taiwan, whatever the polls show, and 80% of the polls show 80% of the people want to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
But I have to say, having spent a lot of time there, that I think that although there are some people who would be resistant, if the PRC leadership woke up one morning and said, you know what, we don't really care, I think you would get independence like that, right? So they have a reason to want to maintain that kind of capability. On the other hand, these 1,500 missiles are sort of, they're short-range missiles, and they're sort of looming over Taiwan, and they create enormous, to use Bob's word, uncertainty, but suspicion, fear, etc. And I think that they can find a different way to do it. Can there be military confidence building measures? Yeah, there could. But first of all, the military in Taiwan doesn't want to do it because I think they fear that somehow the PRC will gain an upper hand here and be able to start pushing in the direction of coerced unification, and they certainly want to avoid that. Even the PRC says that to do this, you need to create political mutual trust. And so their emphasis, and I want to say I agree, and I have some other reasons too, but I agree strongly with Bob that this is not going to be a period in which the PRC is going to push Ma to move ahead on a political security agenda. But they have said that in this period, while they're focusing on economic issues and cultural issues and educational exchange, they do want to try to work toward creation of more mutual political trust. How they would intend to do this remains to be seen. But I think that they have come to understand the politics of Taiwan much better than they did before. And even though Ma won by a, let's say, solid margin this time, he is in, as Bob has said, he's in no position to move ahead on a political agenda. And military confidence building measures certainly fall under that general rubric. So they do have some kinds of things they do which are confidence building. But in terms of real military confidence building, I would say we're not there yet.
Okay. You talked about the impact on China of watching the elections in Taiwan, and I wanted to ask Bob a bit about that. A lot of people in China were able to watch the debates in Taiwan on television, at least through the internet and the like. There were observers from China visiting Taiwan to watch the elections. To me, this is kind of amazing. What do you think is the impact on China of having free, open, honest elections in Taiwan?
You get different opinions on this, Tom. If you've been watching China for a while over the years, you see various hopes that they'll understand democracy and how it works. Hong Kong was supposed to be this kind of a model for China. This was very much in vogue, that Hong Kong would have this soft power and influence China to change its system and so forth. And China is changing its system, but it's doing so within the context of preserving one-party rule. And so they're still at it, preserving one-party rule. And I think they're very determined to do that, they being the senior leaders of China. And I don't see a big change from Hu Jintao to the new generation on this issue. So I'm not very optimistic that this is going to have much of an impact. You have a very powerful administrative structure that can is able to encourage people to think in certain ways that supports the existing system in China, and it can be coercive if it needs to be. And so this is. This isn't Egypt. The Chinese system is a lot deeper rooted, a lot larger, and I think people in China know this. And so this kind of change, it will happen over time, I think, but it's not going to happen soon. And we were waiting for this after Tiananmen, remember?
Right.
We were, and that just didn't happen. And I think that. And so when you go to China, talk to people and lecture and so forth, talk to young people, they basically think what they have is okay. And now they're wide-ranging views, of course, but I think at the top, the senior leaders, the administrative structure, they're not prepared to budge this way, it seems to me.
Well, I guess we're seeing the coercive behavior in Tibet right now. They're clamping down hard. Mm-hmm. Alan, is China worried that the DPP could win the elections 4 years from now?
I don't know about specifically 4 years from now, but I would say two things. One, they always worry the DPP could come back to power because they see the DPP at its heart as a Taiwan independence party. But I think if you push, you get a recognition, and articles talk about this in China, in the mainland. There will be another turn of the wheel. The DPP is likely to come back to power at some point. And so one of the issues, it seems to me, for the PRC is trying to consolidate a relationship across the strait, which is broadly appealing within Taiwan, so that there is not an inclination or an ability, let's put it that way, to really push that kind of agenda. Frankly, I never thought Chen Shui-bian had the ability, and I don't think he really had the illusion that he had the ability to move Taiwan to true independence. He was pushing the envelope. He was trying both in terms of domestic system, but also internationally to get greater recognition for and deepening of the institutions of an independent, sovereign Taiwan. But it wasn't going to happen under his aegis. And one of the things that Bob talked about, the DPP rethinking what it is and where it's heading and moving to the center. It depends what moving to the center means, but one of the issues they're going to have to wrestle with is their approach to the mainland. And there are a lot of different views, I think, within the party about what to do about that. But as of now, I think the PRC would still be concerned that a DPP administration coming to power would eventually sort of move in that direction. Yeah. They thought Tsai was going to move in that direction, even though she's a much more moderate person than Chen Shui-bian was. So I don't think that concern or fear, or however you want to describe it, has gone away. I do think the PRC could do things over the next several years to deepen a sense of confidence within Taiwan that the relationship with the PRC is in the interest of the people of Taiwan. And that their sovereignty is not being directly challenged, even though everybody knows that unification is the ultimate goal. Whether Beijing will do that, I think, is a big question right now.
Obviously, cross-strait relations and the stability of the entire region are of vital importance to the U.S. And Washington said many times that it was neutral in the elections. But did it take any deliberate steps to help President Ma get reelected?
I think it's perceived by the Greens in Taiwan to have taken some steps to do that. When Tsai Ing-wen visited Washington, this was the most notable step, perhaps. When Tsai Ing-wen visited Washington, she had meetings with U.S. officials, and then there was a report, a leak from the U.S. government, suggesting that this official, at least, was not satisfied with her position on the 92 consensus and how she would manage the one China issue in dealing with China. And they were worried about uncertainty. And so they reflected a nervousness about uncertainty and instability, which, if you recall what happened in the period from 1995 until 2008, you found the U.S. government repeatedly being on alert, confronting a situation where there could be combat between the United States and China. Now, they didn't expect it directly, but they had to prepare for it, and it was very tense. And so this is something that, obviously, they don't want to do this. And so her position was reviving that type of a concern. Some other aspects that took place, the U.S. government sent some more senior leaders than they've sent in the past, up to a deputy cabinet secretary from the Department of Energy, to visit Taiwan during this recent period. They've made some progress on visa waiver issues, showing some seeming support for the Ma Ying-jeou administration. This is pretty small potatoes, and maybe these could be seen as just routine types of things. But in the eyes of the Greens, these were seen as showing some support for Ma Ying-jeou. So in general, of course, the position of the United States is that they do not take a position on this issue. And basically, I think they stuck to that. But these pieces of evidence are used by the opponents to say, well, the U.S. clearly favored Ma Ying-jeou over Tsai Ing-wen. And I think from observers in Washington's point of view, yeah, they did, because Ma was the stabilizer and Tsai raised uncertainty.
Sure. Just to add a little history, perhaps you'd like to tell people a bit about the mid-90s time when the U.S. felt that it had to send 2 carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Strait,
right,
to indicate our concern and willingness to do something about the problem.
Well, if you look at this situation, it's very complicated, but I worked for Congress at that time, and the members of Congress thought it would be wise for the president of Taiwan to visit his alma mater, Cornell University. And they felt that he had been treated poorly by the Clinton administration, and that the State Department allegedly had too much influence on his thinking, and the State Department didn't want a visit like this. And so the Congress pressed very hard for this visit. Everybody in the Congress voted for legislation advocating this visit except for one senator. And so the visit took place. Clinton changed his position and gave a visa, and this caused China literally to go ballistic. And so you had these 9 months of off and on live fire exercises in the Taiwan Strait. And that didn't settle down until these 2 aircraft carrier battle groups were sent to the Taiwan Strait. For the most part, there was silence in the U.S. government as this was happening for 6 months, really. Very little was done. And so that tension was I think, very important. My working hypothesis is that President Clinton felt never again should this happen, where the U.S. would have a face-off with Chinese forces in the Taiwan Strait. Now, it's just my own interpretation of the record. I never talked to President Clinton about this, but the bottom line is that this is very bad for the U.S. interests. We don't want this, and this kind of tension repeatedly happened. Not to such a degree, but later on, President Lee Teng-hui said that Taiwan was a separate country. We had a special state-to-state relationship with Taiwan and China. That Taiwan's a state and China's a state. Well, this is Taiwan independence from China's point of view. And again, tension in the Taiwan Straits, military tension as well as other tension. And this military tension was persistent. It kept coming up. Different episodes took place in this period. And so I don't think the U.S. administration wants that type of tension with China. It's very dangerous. And it gets increasingly dangerous with this military buildup of China. Because keep in mind, this military buildup is designed to deter Taiwan. But the capabilities are focused on the United States. I mean, these are capabilities that are designed in case the U.S. intervenes in this situation. And I don't think China's too worried about defeating Taiwan in any war, but they worry about the U.S. intervening in this situation. Their capabilities are designed to deal with that. And so that's the missiles and other things have a function toward Taiwan, but they also have a function for the United States as well.
Taiwan's defense spending has not kept pace with their promises, either under Chen Shui-bian or under Ma Ying-jeou. So that is a concern. But the U.S. position has been, generally speaking, going back many years, don't worry about glitzy weapons systems. You've got a lot of basic things you can do to enhance your defense. One of Ma's positions is the improved relationship across the strait is part of Taiwan's security, and I think that's a fair point. It doesn't vitiate the point that Bob was making, but I think it needs to be added into the mix. Second, on abandon, I totally agree. It's not going anywhere. But there's also a movement to some extent to people who say, oh, we should embrace Taiwan really closely, provide them with all sorts of weapon systems, and in other ways support them, send cabinet level visitors, et cetera, despite the fact that we have this unofficial relationship. Do things which would provoke the PRC. Yeah. That's not going to go anywhere either, as far as I can tell now. You know, what happens after November, I can't tell you. I don't know what will happen. On pressure, back to a point on political pressure on Taiwan. Actually, in 2010, Beijing sort of started to put some political pressure on Ma to do a little bit more. You know, talk more about one China. Talk less about the Republic of China. But as soon as Taiwan came out and started talking about rejecting the 1992 consensus, they dropped it. And they recognized that it was not only not going to get anywhere, it was actually harmful to their objective, which was to keep the DPP out of power. One final thing. The PRC is not really all that happy with the way things are going in one respect. They worry that people in Taiwan will become too satisfied with this current situation. Yeah. And the maintenance of the status quo. And yeah, they would like formal recognition of their sovereignty and independence, but hey, you know, they'll take what they've got, and that this will impede the process of unification over the long term. I don't think that that is the approach of the authorities and the leadership in Beijing, but you do hear voices in the PRC who talk about peaceful separation as a worrisome development, and they look at public opinion polls since Ma came to office, when there has been a growth, for example, in opposition to unification. And so they cite that. I think a lot of other people are saying, look, that's now, it's going to take a long time. Let's develop this relationship. Let's worry about how we're doing in the PRC itself. It'll all come together for sort of the reasons that Bob was talking about, the natural affinity, relationship, dependency that will grow over time. But there is that concern, and I just want to register that.
Okay. We have an awful lot of interesting issues on the table.
My name's Jimmy Tobine from Georgetown. I'm wondering, part of the ECFA agreement has been that, you've mentioned this, that Taiwan is allowed to sort of pursue other FTAs, and now there's this notion of the TPP that President Ma has indicated he would like to join in the next 10 years. I was wondering if you could comment on, you know, sort of the gravitational pull model of cross-strait relations. The big economy across the strait is pulling Taiwan closer. If they were to join something like the TPP, wouldn't that change that dynamic? And you know, what do you think the prospects of that? Thank you.
Well, let me just start. I think, yes, I think that that's what Ma has in mind, and that's part of this diversification. Just one comment on the way you phrased your question. The Taiwan interpretation of ECFA was that once it had been concluded, and it's really a framework, one of the important things is that you need to be at least 4 follow-on detailed agreements, which are tough. But in any case, that Taiwan's position was once that agreement was signed, then they said, we will be free to go and reach FTA or FTA-like agreements with others. The PRC took about the reserved position on that. They didn't really talk about it a lot publicly, but they certainly didn't endorse that position. And privately, what one got was a sense that, well, we'll see how it goes. And they were sort of looking at the Singapore negotiation, saying, let's see what happens with that. And they wanted to see two things. One, how would the trade partner, in that case Singapore, handle the issue of one China and the sovereignty questions? And two, how would Taiwan react in terms of its approach to cross-strait relations if it were successful in some of these things? The answer is not in on those things, but I do think one needs to note that the sovereignty issue lies at the heart of a lot of the PRC's reluctance to do this, that, or the other thing in terms of Taiwan's international space. I think they overdo it by quite a bit, but it is real.
Bob?
Just why I'm sort of a little pessimistic about this. I look at Hong Kong. You know, we thought Hong Kong was going to be this real international player and so forth, and they've just increasingly become part of independent, integrated with southeastern China. Why Taiwan doesn't follow that path is beyond me. I think it probably will follow that path. I think they are following that path. And so the idea of diversification and having these agreements, so that's one reason why I think it's going in that direction. And the other reason is that to have these agreements, they have to change the way they do things in Taiwan. They have to reach agreements. They have to make sacrifices. And the path of least resistance is China, rather than the path of where they reach the standards of a TPP. They're going to have to. They have a great difficulty doing that because it alienates certain constituencies in Taiwan, and the brouhaha that the United States has had with Taiwan over beef is emblematic of how difficult it is to make progress when on an issue that really is not that big a deal, and yet it's just hard to do politically, because and so they don't do it, and so it's the unwillingness to bear cost in Taiwan. That's I find I was talking about defense spending. You know, they don't want to do that. They want to rely on their democracy. That's going to protect them. Democracy is going to protect. And to do these kinds of diversifications are going to be sacrifices. They're going to domestically. They're going to have to sacrifice and alienate constituencies, and they don't. The politicians in Taiwan don't seem to want to do that, which means that I think they might continue along this path with China, where China will be accommodating enough so that they'll be closer to China.
And I'm glad Bob mentioned the beef issue. It's a big issue for the U.S. Where's the beef?
Hi, my name is Kenneth Dowling. I work for the Laogai Research Foundation. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a nonprofit for human rights in China. And I actually wrote a term paper on using your book, On the Brink of the Precipice. And I wrote it about the Bush-Chen years and their turbulence, and the Obama-Ma years and the relative peacefulness. And I was wondering, if a Republican wins in November, if that change in party will make something kind of like the Chen-Bush years, will make it more turbulent. So,
yeah,
interesting.
I guess I would say, number one, I haven't heard any of the Republican candidates address anything that would approach that question.
That may be a good thing.
It may well be a good thing. You don't want Taiwan in the election. It can't be positive. What we do know is that there's a lot of sentiment about the mainland, about PRC trade policy and so on and so forth. And these things, once they get going, could have a cumulative effect and a touch on issues that you wouldn't normally have thought they would. So I can't say that. But I think there has been a very broad consensus that having a peaceful cross-strait relationship is in the interest of the United States. Since that vote that Bob talked about on the resolution to grant Li Denghui a visa, I think there has been a recognition in the Congress that it is not wise to confront the PRC over Taiwan in that way. There's a strong sentiment among some people, for example, and they're quite outspoken, to sell F-16 CD aircraft, which the administration, as well as the Bush administration, has declined to address at this point. Some of them happen to be from Texas, where they would be manufactured. I don't want to impute motives.
Oh, no.
But in any case, you know, there's a strong sentiment that is supportive of Taiwan. And it doesn't want to see Taiwan bullied. And the administration position is exactly the same. Why don't we simply face the fact of the PRC's overwhelming importance to the United States and abandon Taiwan? Because there are a lot of things about Taiwan that are important to the United States, including its democratic processes and system, that it would have effects throughout the region, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know the answer, but I would suspect that any administration would not look to abandon Taiwan, but would rather try to keep things copacetic and try to keep a good relationship with Taipei as well as with Beijing. But nobody misunderstands the importance of the relationship with Beijing at this point. There may be differences about what would be worth challenging Beijing on, but I don't see that kind of turnover.
Bob, you're a great expert in Congress.
Well, the Congress and politics is interesting, but I think we're at a stage, I agree with Alan, we're at a stage where public opinion doesn't want trouble with China. And so to support the F-16 decision, I think public opinion generally, they support Taiwan, but they don't want to get into trouble with China. And they're wary of China. And interest groups seem to check each other out. I mean, some are one way, some are the other way. And so you look at domestic politics in the United States, and I see only one force that would drive the administration or drive whoever takes office to do something disruptive on China and Taiwan, and that is partisanship. And we're in a very partisan period. And so you need to watch partisanship. Rick Perry did say his first trip abroad would be to Taiwan. Yes. Yeah, so I mean, he's no longer a candidate, but he was a candidate, and so I think my general sense is that not a lot is going to happen. But partisanship can drive your policy, and you just have to watch it very carefully. I think that what tends to happen in these cases is that politicians make these statements, and then they get elected, and they look at the reality, and they moderate their position, and that's the standard procedure. But we are in a very partisan period in our country right now, and so I'm not going to make a prediction because I'm just not sure what's going to happen. I don't think Taiwan is the focal point, as Alan said. I think with China it's economics and other issues, but something could happen and make an issue all of a sudden. You know, the Chinese could shoot at American surveillance ships in the South China Sea, and then the attitudes in this country could change a lot. The message of Republicans is Obama is weak. That's the main message that they've been on foreign affairs. They're trying to, and of course he isn't weak in my judgment. I think he's quite strong on foreign affairs. But they're making this point that they're trying to make this point that he's weak, and so that's a little worrisome when you deal with these kinds of issues with China.
I just point out that this is in the direction of embracing Taiwan, not having a Bush country ban kind of
abandoned
tension.
Right.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question, I'm afraid. Way in the back, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Abraham Avilor, retired Foreign Ag Service. What are the prospects for a military confrontation if China doesn't get its way in terms of annexation or unification? In the good old days when Taiwan was still called Formosa, mainland China used to bomb or shell Quemoy and Matsu on a regular basis. And what are the chances they will again resort to force if they don't eventually get their way? Thank you.
Sure. Okay. My sense is that we're in a good spot right now. I don't think China's going to do that kind of thing for the foreseeable future. There may be things could set them off. I'm a little tentative about their decision-making process in foreign affairs and issues like Taiwan. But I think in general, if you look at their interests, they're basically well served by this longer-term approach. It's a long journey that they're on right now. They see it's moving toward unification, so they're happy. If something significant were to happen that showed that they're not moving toward unification, and we've raised the issue of Tsai Ing-wen getting elected, and Alan raised the issue of how they might become impatient with Ma Ying-jeou, these kinds of things, that might change the situation. So but I think for now, we're in a good position. Taiwan can't go back. It can't go back to the assertive pro-independence positions or leanings of the past. So we're just moving forward to greater cooperation, greater integration between these two entities.
I think if you start from that point, it's just a stark difference from the days you were talking about. Second, if they decided it might be a nifty idea to use force, they'd have to contemplate the U.S. and not just the U.S. So, one of the issues in the Chen Shui-bian administration was if President Chen were pushing the envelope so hard that he was seen as stepping over a red line and provoking the PRC in what was a predictable provocation that would potentially lead to force, what should people do? And countries sort of said, well, don't count on me, Charlie. Australia made some statements to this effect. I think there was a mood in other countries that if the U.S. got involved, it might be on its own. Entirely different situation today. And so if it's just a matter of impatience, I don't think that, I think the calculation in Beijing would have to be that they want to take on the United States and its allies. And I don't see a rational basis for that decision. Even for a lot of people in the mainland who, to go back to something I was saying before, who don't see a trend toward unification, a mood toward unification in Taiwan today, believe that patience is in fact the path to eventually get there. This is a decades-long process. This is not a years-long process. I have my sense, perhaps more than Bob's, is this isn't just for the moment. This is a strategic decision. There could be arguments about it at the top leadership in Beijing. I don't dispute that. But a rational decision, if one can presume that, would be that it is not going to be in the PRC's interest to resort to force unless Taiwan formally moved to independence or absolutely somehow closed the door to reunification. One point of reference, look at the anti-secession law that was passed in March of 2005. It was drafted at a time when they thought that Chen Shui-bian was going to, the DPP was really going to sort of take over the legislature and push agendas, et cetera, but they went ahead and passed it anyway, even though that didn't happen. And in that, they lay out some terms for when force might be used. And it's if they moved to formal independence or they took an act which would inevitably lead there, or if they shut the door to reunification. That's a very different set of criteria from their former criteria about using force, which included, well, if it just takes too long. They've abandoned that kind of approach. So I'm pretty hopeful that we're not going to face that situation.
I think that's a good point on which to end our discussion. Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.